Julian came home with the day still clinging to him. The smell of rain on his coat and the soft ache behind his eyes that meant he had been holding himself together too tightly for too long. The lock turned with a familiar, stubborn click. He paused the way he always did, listening for the ordinary signs of an empty house, the refrigerator's low hum, the settling creak of old wood, the silence that had grown so used to wearing Leo's name. Instead, something light skipped down the hallway and caught him by the throat. Laughter. It was unmistakable. Not a sound from the television or a neighbor's window cracked open to the afternoon. It rose and fell, breathless and unguarded, a bright tumble of sound that seemed to trip over itself on the way out of a small chest. Julian's hand stayed on the doorknob, as if it had forgotten what came next. He stood there, heart knocking against his ribs, afraid that if he moved the sound would vanish, that it was only a memory finally growing bold enough to speak. The laughter came again, a quick burst followed by an indignant squeal, as though someone had been tickled without consent, and then decided the joke was worth forgiving. Julian's eyes burned. He took off his coat without realizing it, let it slide to the floor, and stepped inside as quietly as a man could, who had spent a year teaching himself to walk softly. The hallway smelled faintly of soap and crayon. There were shoes by the door that hadn't been there that morning. Small sneakers, with the laces knotted together in the way Leo had learned from a video. Julian followed the sound as if it were a thread, past the framed photographs that had become talismans against forgetting, past the place on the wall where a height chart marked a year that had refused to move. In the living room, afternoon light lay in wide, generous stripes across the rug. Leo was there, cross-legged on the floor, hair falling into his eyes, cheeks flushed with the kind of color Julian had only seen in old pictures lately. He was laughing so hard his shoulders shook, one hand pressed to his mouth as if to keep the sound from spilling everywhere. Opposite him, Miss Alvarez crouched with a ridiculous paper crown slipping sideways on her head, a sock puppet perched on her hand mid-gesture, frozen in theatrical despair. And then, Alvarez was saying in a voice far too serious for a puppet with mismatched button eyes, the dragon realized he had eaten all the cookies and there were none left for the king. Leo's laugh broke free completely then, uncontained and ringing. He slapped his knee, gasping for air, eyes bright and alive in a way that made Julian's chest ache. It had been a year since Julian had heard that sound. A year of careful smiles and nods, of quiet compliance, of laughter that never quite reached Leo's eyes, if it came at all. A year of learning how heavy a house could be when joy left fingerprints on everything, and then disappeared. Mrs. Alvarez noticed Julian first. Her eyes flicked to the doorway, widened a fraction, and then softened. She lowered the puppet, letting it bow solemnly as if concluding a performance. "Looks like the audience has doubled," she said lightly. Leo followed her gaze, for a heartbeat. The laughter hovered on his lips, uncertain. Julian held himself still, afraid to spook it. Then Leo's face opened into a grin that was shy and proud all at once. "Dad," he said, and there was no hesitation in it. "You're early." "I was," Julian managed. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thick with something he hadn't practiced naming yet. He crossed the room and knelt, the rug warm beneath his knee. Up close, he could see the smudge of marker on Leo's fingers, the faint shadow under his eyes that told of nights that were still hard. He could also see the spark that had been missing, catching now on something small and ridiculous and alive. "What did I miss?" Julian asked. Leo glanced at Mrs. Alvarez, conspiratorial. "The dragon," he said. "He's really bad at sharing." Mrs. Alvarez laughed too, a soft, pleased sound. "We were just wrapping up," she said, rising and straightening the crown before setting it on the coffee table. "Your son has a very discerning sense of humor." Julian nodded, swallowing. "I can tell." Mrs. Alvarez gathered her bag, gave Leo's shoulder a gentle squeeze, and murmured something about seeing them tomorrow. At the door she paused. "It's good," she said quietly, and Julian knew she meant more than the puppet show. He watched her leave, the door closing with a finality that felt less heavy than it used to. When they were alone again, the house seemed to hold its breath. Leo shifted, suddenly intent on picking at the rug. "She said the dragon could learn," he said. "About cookies and stuff." Julian smiled. "I think that's true." Leo looked up at him then, searching. "It was funny," he said, as if asking permission. "It was," Julian said immediately. "I heard." Leo's eyes widened. "You did?" Julian nodded. "From the hallway." There it was again, tentative but real, a small laugh testing the air. It didn't explode this time. It settled between them, warm and steady. Julian reached out and pulled Leo into a hug, careful not to crowd him, letting Leo decide how close was close enough. Leo leaned in, his head fitting under Julian's chin like it always had. For a moment, they stayed like that, the sound of the afternoon ticking by around them. Julian thought of all the nights he had lain awake, listening to the silence, measuring time by the absence of that laugh. He thought of the ways grief had taught him to live with less, to lower his expectations, until hope felt like a dangerous extravagance. Leo pulled back first. "Can we have cookies?" he asked. Julian laughed then, surprised by the ease of it. "We can," he said. "We definitely can." They went to the kitchen together, the light changing as the sun dipped lower. Julian took the cookies from the cupboard, handed one to Leo, and watched as Leo took a careful bite. Crumbs dotted the counter. Leo laughed again when one fell, the sound bright and unself-conscious, and Julian let himself believe that laughter, once returned, might find its way back more often than not. Julian liked the house best when it behaved, when surfaces were clear, corners sharp, fabrics folded into obedient rectangles that did not invite questions. Order was not comfort, exactly, but it was close enough that he had learned to accept the substitute. He moved through his mornings with the same precision he brought to everything else, correcting the angle of a chair with his foot, aligning the stack of mail so the edges matched, wiping the counter even when it was already clean. It kept his hands busy. It kept his thoughts from straying too far. Maya noticed these things. She always did. She noticed the way he flinched when a drawer stuck, the way his jaw tightened when something was out of place, as if the house itself were making demands of him he could not refuse. She noticed too the way his voice cooled when she asked questions he wasn't ready to answer, how it became smooth and distant, like glass. Julian told himself that distance was necessary, that if he allowed too much warmth in, it would soften the edges he needed to keep everything from slipping apart. The laundry room was one of the few places in the house that resisted his control. It was narrow and dim, the single window clouded with years of detergent film, the shelves crowded with mismatched bottles and half-used boxes. Maya had claimed it early on, arranging the soaps by scent rather than size, tucking little sachets of lavender between the folded towels. Julian tolerated this because it was easier than arguing, and because the scent reminded him of something gentle he couldn't quite place. He found her there one afternoon, standing very still in front of the open washer, her back to him. The machine was silent, the cycle long finished. A basket of clean linens sat on the floor, untouched. "You forgot these," Julian said, nodding toward the basket. Maya startled, just slightly. "I was about to," she said. She reached in and lifted a sheet, shaking it out with more force than necessary. The fabric snapped in the air, then fell limp in her hands. She folded it quickly, too quickly, her movements sharp and practiced. Julian leaned against the doorframe. "You don't have to rush," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Time, to him, was something to be managed, not wasted. "I'm not rushing," Maya said. She stacked the folded sheet on the counter, then placed another on top of it, aligning the corners with care that mimicked his own. For a moment, they were mirror images, both pretending not to watch the other too closely. Julian's gaze caught on something darker near the hem of the next sheet she lifted. a faint shadow, already fading. He frowned. Did something spill? Maya's hands paused. The sheet hovered between them. It's nothing, she said too quickly. Just water, I think. From the sink, Julian stepped closer, reaching out before he could stop himself. Maya pulled the sheet back, folding it in on itself so the mark disappeared. The movement was small, but it landed between them like a dropped plate. You re-washed these, didn't you? Julian said. Maya set the folded sheet down and turned to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something alert behind her eyes, a readiness that made him uneasy. Of course I did. They're sheets. They were clean yesterday, Julian said. He could hear the edge in his voice, and did nothing to soften it. I remember. I folded them. She crossed her arms. Then I must have imagined the smell. What smell? She hesitated. Just something off. Julian exhaled slowly through his nose. Maya, you can't keep rewashing things because they don't feel right. The detergent's expensive, and it wears out the fabric. She laughed, then a short, humorless sound. That's what you're worried about. He didn't answer. He was watching her, the way her fingers worried at the sleeve of her shirt, the way she avoided his eyes now. Suspicion prickled at the back of his mind, unwelcome and insistent. He had learned, over the past year, that unanswered questions had a way of multiplying. Maya, he said softer, what's going on? Nothing is going on, she said, but the words lacked conviction. She turned back to the counter, picked up another towel, and began to fold it with exaggerated care. I just want things to be clean. So do I, Julian said. She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her face shifted. No, she said quietly. You want things to be perfect. There's a difference. The word hung between them. Perfect. Julian felt it settle into place. Familiar and heavy. He had worn it for so long it felt like part of his skin. What's wrong with wanting that? He asked. Maya sighed. She set the towel down and rubbed her hands together, as if trying to warm them. Nothing, she said, unless it means pretending we don't see what's right in front of us. His chest tightened. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, she said. She gestured to the stack of linens, immaculate and mute. These don't need fixing. Julian, not the way you're trying to fix them. He stiffened. I'm not fixing anything. I'm maintaining. She shook her head. You can call it whatever you want. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the refrigerator drifted in from the kitchen, steady and indifferent. Julian thought of all the things he kept in line, all the ways he measured his days by tasks completed and errors avoided. He thought of the way Maya had flinched when he reached for the sheet, how quickly she had hidden the mark he hadn't even been sure was there. Did something happen? He asked finally. Maya's mouth pressed into a thin line. No. Then why are you acting like this? She laughed again, this time softer, sadder. Because you're acting like you always do. Coldness crept back into his voice, familiar and safe. And what is that supposed to mean? It means you'd rather interrogate a towel than ask how I'm doing, she said. It means you notice stains but not people. The words stung, because there was truth in them, and Julian had never been good at sitting with truth that resisted correction. He straightened, retreating into himself. If you have something to say it, he said. Don't hide it in the laundry. Maya closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something resolute there. Fine, she said. I rewashed the sheets, because I thought I smelled blood, and before you ask, no, nothing dramatic happened. But I didn't want to take the chance that you'd see it and start asking questions I'm not ready to answer. Julian felt the floor tilt, just slightly. Blood, he repeated. It could have been nothing, she said quickly. A nosebleed, a scraped knee. Kids get hurt. Leo wasn't home last night, Julian said. She hesitated again, and this time it was answer enough. He turned away. The room suddenly too small. You should have told me, he said.
His voice was flat, controlled with effort. "I don't like being kept in the dark." Maya's shoulders slumped. "I know," she said. "But you don't make it easy to bring things into the light." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Julian stared at the shelves, at the orderly rows of bottles, at the small lavender sachet tucked behind the bleach. He felt the familiar urge to fix, to scrub away whatever had gone wrong, until it no longer existed. It was the only way he knew how to protect the fragile equilibrium he had built. Behind him, Maya picked up the last of the linens and placed them neatly on the counter. "I'll put these away," she said. Julian nodded, though she couldn't see him. As she passed, he caught the faint scent of lavender, clean and sharp, and wondered how something so carefully tended could still carry the weight of what went unspoken. Julian did not mean to watch them. It happened the way most of his watching did these days, by accident first, and then by choice when he realized stopping would require a decision he wasn't ready to make. He came out onto the back porch with a mug gone cold in his hands, intending only to dump it and rinse the cup. The yard stretched out in the late afternoon, the dirt still dark from yesterday's rain, the grass pressed flat in places where Leo had dragged his heels instead of lifting his feet. Maya was already out there with him. She hadn't mentioned it. She rarely did anymore, as if announcing her movements invited scrutiny. She was tired of defending. They were near the far fence, where the ground dipped slightly and the grass thinned into a stubborn patch of earth that refused to grow anything properly. Leo crouched low, poking at the soil with a stick, intent in the way he became when the world narrowed to something small and manageable. Maya stood a few steps back, arms folded loosely, watching him with an expression Julian couldn't quite read from this distance. He stayed where he was, half in shadow, half lit by the slanting sun. The porch railing pressed into his forearms. From here, they looked like a picture he might have framed once, mother and son in a quiet yard, the day moving gently around them. But the stillness felt wrong, too careful, like a room after an argument, every object pretending nothing had shifted. Leo scraped the dirt harder, the stick making a dry, scratching sound Julian could hear even from the porch. He dug until the soil gave way to something lighter beneath, a paler streak cutting through the dark earth. He stopped, frowned, and leaned closer. Maya moved then, quickly. "Leo," she said, her voice carrying. "That's enough. You'll get filthy." "It's already dirty," Leo said without looking up. Julian felt a strange tightening in his chest. He watched Maya hesitate, saw her glance back toward the house, toward the porch. He stepped further into the shadow, instinctively, though he knew she wouldn't see him unless she was looking for him. She turned back to Leo. "What did you find?" she asked. Leo pinched something between his fingers and pulled it free. A strip of white fluttered briefly, before sagging under the weight of dirt and moisture. He held it up, puzzled. "Why is there a towel in the ground?" The words landed hard. Julian's grip tightened on the mug, until he felt the ceramic protest. He knew immediately, before memory even finished assembling itself. The missing towel. The one Maya had said must have fallen behind the dryer. The one he had believed her about because believing was easier than imagining the alternative. Maya's face drained of color. "It's nothing," she said too fast. "Probably just trash that blew in." "It's ours," Leo said. He wiped at it with the back of his hand, smearing more dirt across the fabric. "It's got the blue line." From the bathroom. Maya reached for it, then stopped herself, hands hovering uselessly. Julian saw her swallow. "Leo, put that down." "Why?" Leo asked. There was no fear in his voice, just curiosity, sharp and insistent. "Why was it buried?" Julian stepped forward before he realized he was moving. The porch board creaked under his foot. Maya's head snapped up, her eyes finding him instantly this time. For a moment none of them spoke. The yard seemed to hold its breath. "What's going on?" Julian asked, though the answer was already blooming, unwelcome in his mind. Leo looked between them. "I found a towel," he said, as if that explained everything. "In the dirt." Julian walked toward them slowly, the distance feeling longer than it was, Up close, he could see the faint discoloration on the towel, the shadow that wasn't quite gone no matter how much dirt covered it. Not bright, not fresh, but unmistakable now that he knew to look. Maya closed her eyes. "I was going to take care of it," she said quietly. "By burying it?" Julian asked. She opened her eyes again, and there was something defensive there now, a brittle edge. "I didn't want it in the trash where anyone could see it." "See what?" Leo asked. Julian crouched beside his son, lowering himself until they were eye level. "Hey," he said gently. "Why don't you go wash your hands, okay? We'll talk in a minute." Leo hesitated, then nodded. He dropped the towel as if suddenly unsure of it and trotted toward the house, dirt streaking his palms and knees. Julian watched him go until the door closed behind him. When he turned back, Maya was already kneeling, gathering the towel with shaking hands. Dirt fell from it in soft clumps. The track was clearer now, a faint line of disturbed soil leading from the back step to the shallow hole where it had been hidden. A path, once you knew how to see it, a towel track. "You dragged it," Julian said. It wasn't an accusation so much as an observation, but it cut all the same. "From the house." Maya's shoulders sagged. "I didn't want him to see it. And what happens when he digs it up himself?" Julian asked. His voice stayed level, but he felt the effort it took to keep it there. "What happens when he starts asking?" She pressed the towel into the dirt, as if trying to fold the ground back over it. "I was trying to protect him." Julian laughed once sharply. "From what?" She looked up at him then, and the yard seemed suddenly too small to hold everything in her eyes. "From you," she said. The words struck harder than he expected. He stood, straightening as if bracing against a blow. "You think I would hurt him?" "No," she said quickly. "I think you'd interrogate him. I think you turn it into something it doesn't need to, and you think burying evidence is better." Julian gestured to the disturbed earth. "This isn't protection, Maya. This is hiding." She rose to her feet, clutching the towel to her chest. "You don't understand," she said. "You see a mark, and you need a reason. You need a timeline. You need someone to blame. Because marks mean something," Julian said. "Because they don't come from nowhere." Maya shook her head. "Sometimes they do. Sometimes they're just like." Julian looked at the towel again, at the faint stain that had driven her to this quiet, desperate act. He thought of the way Leo had laughed the other day, how fragile that sound still felt, how easily it could be chased back into silence. He thought of the laundry room, of her hands folding too fast, of the questions she had dodged. "You should have told me," he said again, though the words felt thinner now, worn from repetition. She nodded, tears finally slipping free. They stood there as the sun dipped lower, the shadows lengthening across the yard, tracing the path the towel had taken. Julian felt the familiar urge rise up to smooth the dirt, to erase the track, to make the yard look as though nothing had ever been disturbed. But the image of Leo crouched in the soil, curious and unafraid, stopped him. "Go inside," he said quietly. "I'll handle this." Maya hesitated, then handed him the towel. Their fingers brushed. Cold and tentative, she turned and walked toward the house, shoulders hunched, leaving Julian alone with the dirt and the evidence he hadn't known he was looking for. He knelt and filled in the hole carefully, pressing the soil down with his palms until it looked almost untouched. Almost. He knew better now. Once you learned to see the track, it was hard to unsee it. The house had a way of closing in at night, corners softening into shadow, sounds traveling farther than they should. Julian waited until Leo was asleep. His door cracked just enough for the hall light to slip through. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the evenness of his son's breathing, as if committing it to memory in case it changed without warning. When he finally turned away, the quiet followed him like an accusation. Maya was in the kitchen, rinsing a mug that was already clean. The towel was gone. He noticed that first, the absence where it should have been hanging from the oven handle. The space looked wrong, unfinished. "We need to talk," Julian said. She didn't turn around. "I figured." He set the towel, now sealed in a plastic bag, from under the sink, on the counter between them. The sound it made was small but decisive. Maya's shoulders tensed. "You took it," he said, "without telling me. You buried it. You decided, on your own, what it meant and what to do about it." She shut off the faucet. Water dripped once, twice, then stopped. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "It's a towel from our bathroom." "It's not just a towel," Julian said. "It's property. It's evidence." She turned then, her eyes flashing. "Evidence of what?" "That's exactly my point," he said. "You don't know, and instead of asking, instead of telling me, you decided to play doctor. You decided to diagnose and treat and dispel." Maya laughed, a brittle sound that cracked at the edges. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Turn this into something ugly by using words like that," she said. "I wasn't playing anything. I was trying to handle it." "Handle it how?" Julian asked. "By washing it until the mark faded. By hiding it in the ground." Her jaw tightened. "You weren't supposed to see it. That's the problem," he said. "You weren't supposed to see it. You took that choice away from me." She folded her arms, mirroring him without meaning to. "And what would you have done with it? Put it under a microscope? Interrogate Leo until he cried?" Julian flinched. "I would have asked questions," he said. "That's what adults do. And I answered them." She shot back. "I told you it could have been nothing." "Could have been," he repeated. "But you didn't know. You assumed." "So did you," she said. "The second you saw it." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth of that sat heavy between them. He pushed past it. "You took something from the house and hid it," he said. "You deprived me of information. That's stealing, Maya, whether you like the word or not." Her face went pale. "You think I'd steal from you? I think you crossed a line," he said. She stared at him, hurt sharpening into something colder. "I crossed a line because I didn't want you to blow this out of proportion. And you get to decide what's proportion. And you get to decide what's proportional," Julian asked. His voice rose despite his efforts. "You don't get to decide that alone. Not when it involves our son." "Our son," she echoed. "Exactly. I was thinking about him." "So was I," Julian said. "You just didn't trust me to." Silence settled, thick and suffocating. The refrigerator hummed on, oblivious. Maya looked suddenly tired, as if the argument had been waiting for her all day. "You think I enjoy this?" she said quietly. "You think I like hiding things? I did it because every time something is out of place, you tighten. You interrogate. You look for fault. And Leo feels it." Julian felt the familiar defensive chill slide into place. "So now this is my fault." "I didn't say that. You implied it." "I said your way isn't the only way," she said. "And sometimes it hurts more than it helps." He gestured to the bag on the counter. "And your way is burying it in the yard." "My way was making sure Leo didn't see it and start worrying," she said. "My way was buying time." "For what?" She hesitated. "To see if it even mattered." Julian shook his head. "You don't get to run experiments on our lives," he said. "You don't get to decide what matters by erasing it." Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "I wasn't erasing him. I was protecting him." "By hiding things from me?" Julian asked. "By taking control where you don't have it." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're not the only one who gets to protect him." The words hit harder than any raised voice. Julian looked away, his gaze catching on the empty oven handle again. He thought of Leo's laughter, how rare and precious it still felt. He thought of the dirt track in the yard, how easy it had been to miss until it wasn't. "You should have told me," he said, softer now, almost weary. "You should have trusted me." Maya nodded slowly. "And you should have trusted that I had a reason." They stood there, the space between them filled with everything they hadn't said. Julian picked up the bag and tucked it under his arm, the gesture deliberate. "What are you going to do?" Maya asked. "I'm not burying it," he said, "and I'm not pretending it doesn't exist." She watched him, fear flickering across her face. Please don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be. He met her eyes. Please don't hide things from me again. Neither of them agreed. The kitchen light hummed overhead, steady and unforgiving, as Julian walked away with the towel, carrying the weight of what had been taken, and what had been revealed. Maya waited until the next morning, until the house had settled back into its careful routines. Leo was at school. The kitchen counters were wiped. The air smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Julian sat at the table with his laptop open but untouched, staring at a spreadsheet he had been pretending to review for the last 10 minutes. The towel was gone, locked away somewhere he hadn't named out loud, and the space it had occupied in his thoughts had only grown larger. "You're not listening," Maya said. Julian looked up.
She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said. "You're bracing." He closed the laptop slowly. "If you have something to say, say it." She took a breath and leaned back against the counter, crossing her ankles. She looked oddly formal, as if she had dressed herself for an interview rather than a conversation in her own kitchen. "You called it playing doctor," she said. "What I did, Julian said. He felt the words stiffen in his mouth. "Because that's what it looked like," Maya nodded. "I figured you'd say that." She paused, then added, "You didn't ask why I knew what I was looking at." Julian frowned. "What are you talking about?" She held his gaze. "You assumed I was guessing." He didn't answer immediately. The assumption had felt so natural, he hadn't noticed it forming. "You didn't tell me otherwise." "I tried," she said quietly. "You just didn't hear it." Julian's jaw tightened. "Then hear me now." Maya pushed off the counter and sat across from him. She placed her hands flat on the table, palms down, steadying herself. "Before Leo was born," she said. "Before we met, I worked in pediatric care." Julian blinked. The words slid past him at first, refusing to settle. "You volunteered," he said automatically. "You mentioned that." "I didn't volunteer," she said. "I trained." The silence that followed was different from the ones they were used to. It wasn't heavy or brittle. It was sharp, like a held breath that didn't know when to let go. "In what capacity?" Julian asked. Maya's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was a pediatric nurse," she said. "For 6 years." Julian felt something inside him tilt. A careful internal structure, suddenly off balance. "You never told me that." "I told you I worked with kids," she said. "You never asked for more." "That's not the same thing," he said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "That's significant." She nodded. "I know. You let me believe." He stopped himself, annoyed by the heat rising in his chest. "Why would you keep that from me?" Maya looked down at her hands. "Because the moment I tell people, they stop seeing me. They see the credential. They assume things about what I think, what I'll do, what I'll notice." Julian laughed once, incredulous. "And you don't see the irony in that?" She looked up. "I do. That's why I didn't say anything last night, or the night before, or the first time you accused me of overreacting about a bruise." His shoulders stiffened. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," she said. "You trust systems, titles, processes. You don't trust intuition unless it comes wrapped in authority." Julian pushed back from the table and stood. He paced once, then again, the movement sharp and restless. "So you decided to sit on this? To let me think you were just panicking?" "I decided to be his mother," she said. "Not his case file." Julian stopped pacing. "That stain," he said. "You recognized it." "Yes." "And you decided it wasn't serious." "I decided it wasn't immediately alarming," she said carefully. "There's a difference." And you didn't think I deserved to know that judgment came from training? He asked. I didn't think you would hear it, she said, not without turning it into a hierarchy. The word stung. Julian crossed his arms, the familiar defensive posture settling in. So this is about my pride now? Maya sighed. It's about power. He scoffed. I'm not the one hiding credentials. I wasn't hiding, she said. I was choosing when to speak. And when was that going to be? Julian asked. After I accused you of stealing, after I treated you like you were reckless. Her eyes softened. And that, somehow, made it worse. I was waiting for you to ask me what I thought, she said. Not what I'd done wrong. The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Julian felt the familiar urge to argue, to dissect the conversation until it bent back into something he could control. Instead, he felt something else creep in, slower and more corrosive. You let me look like a fool, he said quietly. Maya winced. I never wanted that. But you did, he said. You watched me posture and accuse and assume I knew better. All while you were sitting on experience I didn't have. She met his gaze steadily. And you would have listened. He hesitated steadily. And you would have listened. He hesitated. The answer that rose unbidden was not the one he wanted to give. I don't know, he admitted. They stood there, the kitchen suddenly unfamiliar, as if the revelation had shifted the furniture without moving a thing. Julian felt exposed, not because Maya knew more than he did, but because she had let him reveal exactly how much he relied on that not being the case. You should have told me, he said again, though the words felt thinner now, less certain. Maybe, she said, or maybe you should have trusted me before you needed proof. He looked away, his gaze catching on the faint smear of sunlight on the floor. He thought of all the ways he had defined himself by competence, by knowing, by being the one who saw what others missed. The idea that Maya had been quietly carrying expertise all this time felt like a theft of something he hadn't realized he claimed as his own. So when you saw the towel, he said, you weren't guessing. No, she said. I was assessing. And you didn't think it warranted escalation. I thought it warranted watching, she said. Carefully, calmly, without making Leo feel like his body was a problem to solve. Julian closed his eyes. The image of Leo crouched in the dirt rose unbidden, curious and unafraid, holding the towel like a question no one wanted to answer. You undermined me, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Maya's expression hardened. I protected him, she said. If that undermined you, maybe that's worth examining. He opened his eyes, anger flaring briefly before collapsing into something heavier. You don't get to decide that alone, he said. But the conviction was gone. She nodded. Neither do you. They stood in silence again, the distance between them no longer sharp but deep, filled with things that would not be resolved by naming them once. Julian felt the uncomfortable truth settle in. This wasn't just about a towel or a stain or even trust. It was about the fragile architecture of who they believed themselves to be, and how easily it cracked when exposed to another version of competence. I don't like feeling stupid, he said finally. Maya's voice softened. And I don't like not being the one in control, he added. I know that too, she said. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not defiance but exhaustion. Saw how long she must have been carrying this, waiting for the right moment that never quite came. I need time, he said. She nodded. Take it. As she turned away, Julian remained where he was, the echo of her words lingering. Hidden credential, hidden track. He wondered how many other things he had missed, because he'd been so busy, believing he already knew where to look. Julian ordered the cameras at midnight, the house dark and quiet except for the faint whir of the dishwasher. He told himself it was practical, that it was about clarity,
about removing doubt from a situation that had grown too slippery to trust anyone's instincts, including his own. He did not tell himself the smaller, sharper truth, that he wanted proof of recklessness, of negligence, of something that would justify the unease that had taken up residence in his chest. The boxes arrived 2 days later, marked and efficient. He installed them while Maya was out, his movements careful and methodical, the way they always were when he needed to feel competent again. One in the living room, tucked high on a shelf, where it could see the whole space without being obvious. One angled toward the back door, one in the hallway, just far enough from Leo's room to tell himself it wasn't invasive, just observant. He told himself he wasn't spying. He was safeguarding. That night, after Leo was asleep and Maya was in the shower, Julian sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the live feeds tiled neatly across the screen. The house looked different, flattened into pixels, smaller and more manageable. He watched the empty living room for a long time, the couch cushions bearing the soft impressions of earlier use, the floor scattered with the remnants of a day, a forgotten sock, a book left face down, a toy car parked at an angle like it had been abandoned mid-thought. When Maya emerged from the bedroom and crossed the living room, Julian's muscles tensed automatically. He leaned closer to the screen, waiting for something to sharpen, to reveal itself. She moved slowly, tidying without hurry, humming under her breath. She picked up the sock, shook it once, and carried it down the hall. Nothing more. He felt a flicker of irritation. Evidence, it seemed, was not interested in presenting itself on command. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Julian watched in stolen moments, during lunch breaks, late at night, early mornings, when the house was still quiet. He told himself he was looking for signs. What he found instead unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Leo appeared on the screen more often than not, in motion, not the tentative, inward child Julian had grown used to cataloging with careful concern, but a version of his son that seemed looser, louder. Leo sprawled on the floor with markers, talking to himself as he drew. He built elaborate structures from cushions and blankets, narrating their purpose in a steady, confident voice. He laughed softly at first, then louder, full-bodied, the sound Julian still felt each time like a hand closing around his heart. Maya was there in the background, present without hovering. She knelt when Leo needed her, sat back when he didn't. She listened more than she spoke. When Leo stumbled over a word, she waited. When he grew frustrated, she acknowledged it without rushing to fix it. Julian watched her do things he hadn't known how to name before, small calibrations of attention and restraint that left room, instead of filling it. One afternoon, Julian watched Leo come home from school and head straight for the kitchen table. He dumped his backpack out with dramatic flair, papers sliding everywhere. Maya started to gather them, then stopped herself. She watched Leo sort them instead, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He narrated the process, explaining which papers mattered and which didn't, his logic meandering but assured. "Look," Leo said, holding up a drawing to the camera's unblinking eye. "I made it bigger." Maya smiled. "You did," she said. "How does it feel?" Leo considered this. "Better," he said finally. Julian stared at the screen. "Bigger. Better." The words echoed. He had expected to see mistakes, lapses, moments where Maya's judgment faltered, and he could step in, justified. Instead, he saw progress unfolding in real time, unforced and undeniable. He saw his son's shoulders sit a little higher, his movements less guarded. He saw joy returning not in sudden leaps, but in steady increments, the kind that were easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. At night, Julian lay awake replaying clips in his mind. He felt a creeping dissonance, the discomfort of a hypothesis quietly disproving itself. Each day that passed without incident felt like an accusation of its own. One evening, He watched Maya and Leo in the backyard, the camera catching them in the same patch of earth where the towel had once been buried. Leo dug again, this time with purpose, planting seeds Maya handed him from a small packet. They pressed the soil down together, fingers muddy, laughter drifting faintly through the microphone. "What happens now?" Leo asked. "Now we wait," Maya said. "And we water. And we watch." Julian closed the laptop with more force than necessary. The words lingered anyway. He began to notice the ways the cameras captured him too, though he wasn't in frame. The times he entered a room, and Leo's voice dipped, just slightly. The moments when Maya glanced toward the shelf, toward the place where the small black eye watched from above. He told himself she didn't know. He told himself it didn't matter. But it did. The surveillance gave him too much time to think, too much space to notice the gap between his intentions and their impact. He had installed the cameras to catch her failing, and instead they reflected back a different failure, quieter and harder to name. One night, long after everyone else was asleep, Julian pulled up the footage from earlier that day. Leo was in the living room, building something out of blocks, narrating a story Julian hadn't heard in months. The plot was chaotic and earnest, full of danger that resolved itself without catastrophe. Maya's voice floated in from off-screen now and then, encouraging without directing. Julian felt something give way. Not dramatically, just enough. He shut the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The house felt less like a system to be monitored, and more like a living thing he had been holding too tightly. He thought of Maya's words, of watching carefully without making the body a problem to solve. He thought of how much he had wanted control, and how little control had actually given him. The next morning he stood on a chair and removed the camera from the living room shelf. He did it quietly, unscrewing the mount with deliberate care, as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile. He set it in the box. It had come in, and taped it shut. He didn't tell Maya. Not yet. That afternoon he came home early, and found Leo at the table, drawing. Maya was nearby, reading. Julian watched them for a moment from the doorway. No lens between them now, just his own unmediated sight. Leo looked up and grinned. "Dad," he said, "I made it bigger." Julian smiled back, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. "I see that," he said. And for the first time in a long while, he meant it without needing proof. Julian noticed Maya's shoes first. They were by the door when he came downstairs late, the rest of the house already dimmed for the night. Not the ones she wore to the grocery store or to Leo's school events, but the softer pair with the worn soles, the ones she favored for long walks. Her jacket was gone from the hook. The clock on the stove blinked 9:42, a time that felt neither early nor late enough to explain anything on its own. He stood there longer than necessary, listening. Leo's room was quiet. The house held steady. There was no note, no text waiting on his phone. Maya had been careful about that lately, careful not to invite questions unless she was ready to answer them. Julian picked up his keys. The night was cool and clean, the kind that made the neighborhood feel smaller, stitched together by the same pools of streetlight and the low murmur of distant traffic. He followed at a distance he told himself was reasonable, his steps quiet, his presence unannounced. He hated the way it felt familiar. This watching, hated how easily his body slipped into it, how natural it seemed to trail just far enough back to remain unseen. Maya walked with purpose, not hurried, but certain, turning left where Julian would have expected right, cutting through a side street he rarely used. The houses changed gradually, lawns giving way to concrete stoops, windows closer together, light spilling out in uneven patches. Julian slowed as she did, staying across the street now, his reflection briefly catching in darkened windows as he passed. She stopped in front of a low brick building wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered bakery. The sign above the door was modest, easy to miss. A name, a symbol, hours posted in small print. No fanfare, no indication of how much life might move through those doors. Maya unlocked it without hesitation. Julian crossed the street and stood under a street lamp pretending to check his phone. Through the front window he could see the interior lit warmly. Nothing clinical about it at first glance. A few chairs, a desk, shelves lined with neatly labeled bins. Maya moved through the space with ease, setting down her bag, tying her hair back. Another woman emerged from a back room, older, smiling, saying something Julian couldn't hear. Maya laughed softly in response, the sound familiar and yet placed somewhere new. A man came in next, then a young woman. They were greeted by name, offered seats, water. No rush, no tension. Julian felt the strange sensation of watching a part of someone's life that existed entirely without him, not hidden so much as simply unshared. He edged closer, close enough now to see more clearly through the glass. Maya knelt to speak with the young woman, her posture relaxed. Attentive, she listened, she nodded, she placed a hand briefly, gently on the woman's arm, then withdrew it, leaving space. Julian recognized the movements from the camera footage, the same careful balance of presence and restraint. This was not new. That realization settled slowly, heavily. This was practiced. The older woman handed Maya a clipboard. Maya scanned it, asked a question, wrote something down. There was no performance to it, no urgency designed to impress, just work being done by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Julian felt a tightening behind his ribs, something uncomfortably close to shame. He stayed until nearly 11, watching people come and go, watching Maya move between roles with quiet competence. No drama, no secrets revealed in a rush, just consistency, built over time. The sign on the door flipped to closed. The lights dimmed one by one. Maya and the other woman locked up together, exchanging a few words before parting ways. Julian stepped back into shadow as Maya emerged, pulling on her jacket. She paused on the sidewalk, breathing in the night, her shoulders loosening as if she were setting something down. Then she started home. He didn't follow this time. When Maya returned, Julian was sitting at the kitchen table, the overhead light off, a single lamp casting a small contained pool of yellow. He didn't look up when she came in. He listened to the familiar sounds. Keys in the bowl, jacket hung, shoes slipped off. She stopped when she saw him. "You're up," she said. "Yes," he said. There was a beat of silence. Then carefully, "Did you need something?" Julian lifted his head. "I followed you." Her face closed, just slightly. "I figured you might." He waited for anger, for accusation. It didn't come. Instead, she set her bag down and leaned against the counter, the way she had the morning she told him about her training. "You saw it," she said. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then you know." "I didn't," he said. "Not really." She studied him, measuring something. "How long were you out there?" "Long enough," he said. Another pause. The air between them felt charged. Not volatile, but full, like something important had finally entered the room. "It's volunteer," she said, though he hadn't asked. "Evenings. A few nights a week. Basic care. Referrals. Listening. Mostly. You run it," Julian said. She tilted her head. "We run it." He absorbed that. The quiet plural. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maya's gaze dropped to the floor, then lifted it. "Because I didn't want it to become an argument about time or risk or why I needed to do it at all. And Leo, he doesn't know the details," she said. "Just that I help people. He's proud." The word landed gently, firm. Julian leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing down in a way that felt deserved. "I thought you were hiding," he said. "I was living," she replied. He nodded slowly. "You're very good at it." Her expression softened, but she didn't smile. "I've had practice." The silence that followed was different again. Not sharp, not heavy, just honest. "I didn't come here to accuse you," Julian said finally. "I think I did that enough already." "And why did you come?" she asked. He exhaled. "Because I needed to see who you are when I'm not watching." Maya's mouth curved. Just a little. And And you're the same, he said. You're just larger. She considered that. That's fair. Julian stood, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. I'm sorry, he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be real. She nodded, accepting it without ceremony. Thank you. They stood there, the house quiet around them, the night pressing gently against the window. Julian thought of the cameras boxed away, of the things he had mistaken for control. He thought of the clinic's warm light, spilling out onto a dark street, easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. I don't want to follow you anymore, he said. Maya met his eyes. Then it was not a demand. It was an invitation. Julian reached for the lamp and turned it off, letting the kitchen sink back into shadow. For once, the dark did not feel like something to be managed. It felt like Julian woke before the alarm, the way he had been waking for weeks now, his mind already moving before his body caught up. The house was still, the early light thin and undecided at the window. He lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet he had once worked so hard to preserve, and felt it differently now, not as proof of order, but as a question. He got up and padded down the hall. Leo's door was open. Inside, Leo slept sprawled diagonally across the bed, one arm flung over the edge. His face relaxed in a way that still surprised Julian when he saw it. There was a softness to him lately, a looseness Julian could not trace back to any single chain. It had simply arrived, quietly, like water finding its level. Julian stood in the doorway longer than necessary. He tried to remember the last time he had sat on the edge of that bed without an agenda, not to check a temperature, not to count breaths, not to straighten blankets or note bruises, or reassure himself that everything was fine, just to be there. He couldn't remember. Downstairs, Maya was already awake. She stood at the counter slicing fruit, the radio low, the day beginning around her without ceremony. Julian watched her from the doorway, noticing the things he had missed before, the way she hummed when she concentrated, the way she paused between cuts to adjust the bowl so nothing spilled, the small kindness she offered even to inanimate objects. Morning, she said, without turn. Morning, he replied. He poured coffee and sat at the table, wrapping his hands around the mug without drinking. The warmth seeped into his palms. He thought of the clinic, of the easy competence with which she had moved through it, of the way people had leaned toward her without hesitation. He thought of Leo's laugh, returning in increments he hadn't earned. I've been thinking, Julian said. Maya glanced over, measuring his tone. That sounds dangerous. He smiled faintly. For me, yes. She waited. I used to think my job was to provide, he said, to make sure nothing was missing, that bills were paid, that problems were addressed before they grew teeth. And, she asked gently, and I think I confused provision with presence, he said. The words felt heavy, but right. I kept us solvent, stable. I thought that was the same thing as keeping us whole. Maya set the knife down and joined him at the table. She didn't interrupt. She had never been one to rush a confession. I built myself into something solid, Julian continued. Reliable, predictable. I thought if I stood still enough, nothing bad could happen around me, he exhaled. I was very proud of that statue. Maya's eyes softened. Statues don't bend, she said. No, he said. They don't listen either. The image came to him then with uncomfortable clarity. Himself rendered in stone, arms full of resources, feet planted firmly in the ground, immovable, and admired from a distance, useful, impressive, untouchable, and utterly incapable of kneeling down in the dirt with his child, or sitting quietly with his wife while something unfixable passed between them. I was a checkbook father, he said. The phrase tasted bitter, but true. I showed up in transactions, in solutions, in coverage. Maya didn't contradict him. And you, he said, meeting her gaze. You were there in ways I couldn't see because they didn't leave receipts. She smiled faintly at that, but her eyes shone. I was just there. With his fear, Julian said. With his questions, with the parts of him that don't want to be solved. He swallowed. I kept trying to manage his pain instead of making room for it. Maya reached across the table and rested her hand over his. The contact was light. Deliberate. You were scared. I still am. He admitted. That doesn't disqualify you, she said. It just means you're human. Julian nodded, feeling something inside him finally crack. Not break apart violently, but split open along a fault line that had been there all along. He had spent so long holding himself rigid that he had mistaken tension for strength. Letting go felt terrifying. It also felt like relief. Later that morning, he walked Leo to school. It was a small thing, easily overlooked. But Julian felt the difference in his body. He didn't check his phone. He didn't rush. Leo talked, meandering from topic to topic, and Julian listened without steering him back to what he thought mattered. At the gate, Leo hesitated. You're coming to the thing on Friday, right? He asked. Julian opened his mouth to calculate, to check schedules and obligations. Then he closed it again. Yes, he said. I am. Leo smiled, bright and unguarded, and ran off without looking back. Julian stood there after the bell rang, watching the children scatter. He felt lighter and heavier all at once, the way one does after setting something down only to realize how much weight it had been carrying. That evening he found Maya in the backyard, kneeling in the garden bed with dirt on her hands. The seedlings had begun to push through the soil, small and stubborn and alive. Can I help? He asked. She looked up, surprised, then nodded. Sure. He knelt beside her, the ground cool through his jeans. He didn't ask what to do right away. He watched her hands, mirrored her movements when she showed him how to thin the sprouts without pulling them up entirely. You don't have to do it perfectly, she said. He smiled. I'm learning. As the sun dipped lower, they worked in companionable quiet. Julian thought of the cameras, boxed away, of the clinic's warm light, of the statue he had mistaken for himself. It had taken watching, really, watching, to see what had been growing all along. Not under surveillance, not under control, but under care. When Leo came out and joined them, dropping to the ground with cheerful abandon, Julian didn't correct the dirt on his hands or the knees of his pants. He handed him a small trowel and watched him dig. Listened to his commentary. Let the moment unfold without shaping it into something more efficient. The statue crumbled quietly then, not into ruin, but into soil. And for the first time Julian understood that this too was a kind of provision. The house had never been so full. Julian stood near the entryway, adjusting his cufflinks for the third time, watching the living room swell with people who knew him in a very specific way. They arrived polished and assured, coats handed off without hesitation, voices already warmed by familiarity and shared history. Colleagues, donors, board members, the kind of guests who spoke in summaries and understood one another in shorthand. The house bent itself around them, accommodating their laughter, their expectations, their ease. He had hosted gatherings like this before. They usually left him energized, affirmed. Tonight he felt oddly peripheral, as if the event were happening slightly to the left of where he stood. Maya moved through the room with a different rhythm. She greeted people warmly but without performance, her attention real and unhurried. She wore a simple dress, nothing that announced itself, and yet Julian found his eyes tracking her anyway, noting how often conversations softened when she joined them, how people leaned in without realizing what.
He had told her she didn't need to do this. The gala, the open house, the blur of his professional world bleeding into their private one. She had smiled and said it was fine, that Leo was excited. That more than anything had unsettled him. Leo appeared at the top of the stairs, just as the room reached its peak. He paused there, taking it all in, his small frame silhouetted against the light. Julian's instinct was to move toward him, to offer guidance, a hand, a buffer against the attention. He stopped himself. Leo descended slowly, carefully, as if aware that the moment mattered. Conversations faltered as people noticed him, smiles blooming reflexively. Someone murmured his name. Another guest crouched slightly, offering a greeting at eye level, Leo smiled, wide and unguarded. Julian felt something tighten in his chest, not fear this time, but awe. "Hey," Leo said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without demanding it. He reached the bottom step and looked around, searching. His eyes found Maya across the room. "There you are," he said, and crossed to her without hesitation. Maya knelt to meet him, brushing an imaginary speck from his sleeve. "You okay?" she asked. Leo nodded. Then, without warning or preamble, he turned back to the room. "Hi," he said again, louder now. The hush that followed was unintentional, but complete. Julian's breath caught. He hadn't known Leo was planning anything. He hadn't known there was anything to plan. Leo glanced at Julian briefly, then back to the faces turned toward him. He stood straighter. "My dad does a lot of important stuff," he said. A ripple of approving smiles moved through the crowd. Julian felt heat rise in his face. "But my mom," Leo continued, "she's the reason I'm okay." The room went very still. "She helps people," Leo said, earnest and sure. "She listens. She fixes things you can't see. She helps me when I'm scared. She helped me learn how to laugh again." Julian felt the words land one by one, each finding its mark. "She's the best," Leo finished simply. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then someone began to clap, others followed, the sound spreading, filling the space with something warmer than approval, pride, recognition. Maya's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining, caught entirely off guard. Julian stood frozen, the world narrowing to the small figure of his son, and the woman he had so thoroughly understood. Maya shook her head slightly at Leo, half laughing, half crying. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I wanted to," Leo said. Julian moved then, crossing the room without thinking, kneeling beside them. He placed a hand on Leo's back, steady and grounding. "You did great," he said, his voice thick. Leo beamed. "I know." Laughter bubbled up around them, gentle and relieved. Conversations resumed, but something had shifted. People approached Maya now with a different curiosity, a different respect. Julian watched it happen, not with defensiveness, but with a strange, expansive pride. Later, as the evening softened and guests began to drift out, Julian stood with Maya by the kitchen island, the remnants of the gala scattered around them, like evidence of a storm that had passed without damage. "You didn't tell him to do that," Julian said quietly. She shook her head. "No." He nodded, absorbing that. He meant every word. "Yes," she said. Julian looked at her then, really looked, and felt the last brittle remnants of his old self give way. The man who needed to be the most competent in the room, the one who measured worth in visible contributions. "You deserved that," he said. Maya smiled, tired and luminous. "So did you," she replied. He shook his head. "I'm still learning." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "So am I." Across the room, Leo sat on the floor with a few lingering guests, animatedly explaining something about the garden, his hands moving as fast as his words. Julian watched him, unafraid and fully himself, and felt the quiet certainty settle in. This was the public step he hadn't known they needed. Not a declaration or a correction, but an acknowledgement of who had been carrying what, of who they were becoming. Julian leaned back against the counter, the noise of his world fading into something manageable, something human. For once he did not feel the need to take center stage. He had already been seen. 2 years had passed since the afternoon the towels were laid in the mud, but the air at the Vane estate felt entirely different now. The sterile silence that once defined Julian's life had been replaced by the rhythmic sound of a soccer ball bouncing against a stone wall and the bright, confident laughter of a child who no longer saw himself as a tragedy. Julian stood on the same balcony where he had once sneered at a maid, watching his son, Leo, sprint across the lawn, without the slightest hint of a limp. The guilt that had once frozen Julian's heart had finally thawed, replaced by a profound, humbling gratitude toward the woman who had dared to defy him. Julian turned away from the window and looked at the document on his desk. It wasn't a quarterly earnings report or a cold merger agreement. It was the charter for a new legacy. For years he had believed that being a billionaire meant having the power to fix everything with a checkbook, but Maya had taught him that true power was the ability to see the potential in people that society had discarded. He picked up his pen, his hand steady, and signed his name at the bottom of the Vein Maya Institute for Pediatric Rehabilitation Partnership Agreement. He walked downstairs, passing a wall of photos that documented the last 24 months. Images of Leo taking his first steps, Maya receiving an honorary recognition from the medical board, and Julian himself, covered in dirt while playing on the floor with his son. He found Maya in the sunroom, her hair pulled back, and her posture as dignified as it had been the day she was kneeling in the mud. She was reviewing a case file for a young girl from the peripheral neighborhood, who had been told she would never walk again. Maya, Julian said softly, causing her to look up. She still offered him a polite smile, but the flicker of nervousness he had once seen in her eyes was long gone. They were peers now. The board has just approved the final expansion. We're opening the third community branch next month. Maya stood up, her eyes shining with the same burning flame of passion Julian had witnessed when she first defended her brother Miguel. Thank you, Julian. You have no idea what this means for those families. To have a place where they aren't just a clinical number, but where someone truly believes in the impossible. Julian stepped forward, extending the folder he was carrying. There's one more thing. I'm stepping down as the acting chairman of the foundation. I've realized that while I have the capital, I don't have the vision. You are no longer the private therapist, or an employee of this house, Maya. This contract names you the executive director with full autonomy. It's justice, recognition for everything you gave back to my family when I didn't deserve it. Maya hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she took the folder, much like they had the night she was first discovered. Julian, I was just trying to help a little boy smile again, and in doing so you helped a grown man see again. Julian replied, his voice thick with emotion. You taught me that the true value of a person isn't measured by a diploma or a social status, but by the size of their heart. As if on cue, the doors swung open, and Leo raced into the room, throwing his arms around Maya's waist. Aunt Maya, did you see? I did 10 goals in a row. He looked up at his father, his eyes sparkling with an unshakable self-confidence. Are we going to the center today? I want to show the new kids how to do the towel track exercise. Julian knelt down, matching his son's level, and pulled both Leo and Maya into a single embrace. The Wellington family's story had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that miracles often come wrapped in the simplicity of those who serve with unconditional love. He looked at Maya over his son's shoulder, a silent promise in his gaze that he would never again let a person's worth be determined by the uniform they wore. Together, they walked out toward the garden, not as a billionaire and his maid, but as a family bound by the truth that love makes all things possible.